This is Dane Wigington with geoengineeringwatch.org. Today, I'm going to have a dialogue with a particularly important individual that's been working directly with geoengineeringwatch.org. He's worked with NASA in the past, and he is monitoring the incredibly intense UV radiation that's now bombarding our planet. That is directly related to the ongoing global climate engineering, geoengineering, solar radiation management, climate intervention programs that are decimating Earth's life support systems, Earth's protective atmosphere, disrupting the hydrological cycle, toxifying the entire planet. The threat that geoengineering poses to all of us is, mathematically speaking, the greatest and most immediate threat we face short of nuclear cataclysm. The vast majority of first world populations are going about their lives as if nothing is wrong, as if the paradigm they've known will somehow magically keep going in spite of all the converging catastrophes that are closing in on us all. Industrialized, militarized societies have wreaked havoc on the planet. And this cannot continue. It will not continue. It's unraveling by the day. As I introduce Ray, and we will keep his last name anonymous at this point for his own protection for obvious reasons, Ray's provided essential UV metering data for geoengineeringwatch.org, and his contribution to trying to bring to light the severity of the UV radiation issue, the threat it poses to every living thing on this planet. That data is again critical. The population doesn't understand the severity of the threat that is already facing us from the ozone layer depletion directly related to the climate engineering operations. Ray, can you hear me?
I hear you great, Dane.
Thank you for joining us today, Ray, and my thanks to the ongoing work that you're doing, your service to humanity, and the fight for the greater good. For the listeners, can you describe the type of work you did while you were at NASA?
Well, the project I was involved with was part of ERAST, which is the Environmental Research and Sensors Technology. The program was to provide a platform, a remote piloted vehicle platform at 80,000 feet to carry atmospheric instruments.
So by the nature of that work, you were working with various measurements, readings that are involved with the atmospheric conditions at those altitudes, correct?
Well, the primary purpose of me being there was that they needed vehicles to get to 80,000 feet, and that was primarily the reason that I was employed, was to, help them get those vehicles up to 80,000 feet. Our particular project reached 65,000 feet, and they considered that a world record at the time. One of the Helios participants reached 80,000 feet and above, but we had a payload capacity of 200 pounds on our aircraft, and it was a remote piloted vehicle that would carry, say, payloads from Harvard or Cornell or MIT, atmospheric gathering instruments up to altitude to measure particulates and radiation levels. The aircraft was designed with an extremely low bow wave, which means it doesn't put undue pressure on the air in front of it so that it can sense undisturbed air as closely as possible.
That makes sense. And how many years, Ray, did you work at NASA?
I was there for 2 years.
And in the field in general, how many years?
Well, I've been an avionics engineer now for about 45 years.
Now, what woke you up to the geoengineering issue, Ray? When did you first become aware of geoengineering?
It started slow, Dane. When I first was employed there at NASA, I really didn't have a clue about what was going on with the ozone layer. I didn't understand what they wanted to do at altitude with the atmospheric instruments. And it was a slow process with me because I was just trying to get them a platform that operated correctly through the adverse environmental conditions, because, the temperatures drop to minus 45, minus 50 degrees centigrade when you're up at those altitudes. And just trying to get an avionics platform operational is pretty tough. But
in the course of that work, that you were doing, though, at what point and what do you remember? What event or news that you might have seen that woke you up to the geoengineering issue?
Well, there were two pieces, and I had friends at JPL, and I was keeping track of what they were doing, and there was a blurb in the paper about how they had resolved the 8th bit on a particular group of satellite data, that they could not figure out what was going on with it. They finally resolved this 8th bit into the upper ozone layer. And then I started asking questions about why were they interested in this, what was going on with it. And some of the scientists near me while I was at NASA, I approached them and asked them, what's the problem? And they said basically it was the chloromethane molecule they were most concerned with. And that is what really started my whole interest in the upper ozone layer. I wanted to know why the tie-in with the chloromethane molecule.
Now, in the course of how you and I connected, when I was giving information to the local ABC station here in Northern California, KRCR, to the news anchor at that station. And in the course of that dialogue and that station in Northern California, mainstream media station, and them patently denying any geoengineering data they were given, everything. And you jumped into that conversation courageously with your background to make clear that the data that geoengineeringwatch.org was giving to this mainstream media station was in fact correct, and they didn't want to communicate anymore after that. Do you remember that?
I remember it very well, Dane. I still have the emails that I sent to Mike Mangus, and I was very disappointed over that whole affair.
And this is what we have from mainstream media, isn't it? Their job is to cover up the threats, to hide them from the populations as long as possible. That's the job they've been tasked with. They're all too happy to do it. And let's continue on with our conversation, but let's also hope that one day soon, when the population understands this is an existential threat, climate engineering itself is an existential threat for countless reasons, not just the ozone destruction, but when the population wakes up, that they will hold legally and morally accountable all those who are accomplices in the crimes of the climate engineering cover-up, like Mike Mangus, like Silas Lyons at the Record Searchlight in Northern California paper, and like countless other mainstream media puppets who are simply doing the bidding of the power structure. But moving on, and that's how you and I connected, and we've been working together ever since. What made you willing to speak out about the geoengineering issue and the threats that climate engineering operations pose to us, the biosphere, and the web of life?
Well, it really had a lot to do with the website that you put up. I've been watching NASA's progress in trying to figure out the atmosphere over the years, and I had a vague awareness of what the ozone layer was doing, and I wasn't happy about it. But when I went to your website, it really hit home, because my first impression when I got to your website was, this can't possibly all be true. And I did some fact-checking. I checked out one item. It came out to be exactly as you portrayed it. The data was correct. I went to the next one. The next one was the same way. It was accurate and correct. And I did it 3 times, Dane. And then I got a hold of you, because I said, this is somebody who has a clue. I better find out more. And you and I first connected.
Well, you know how much I appreciate your courage in reaching out. If we had more like you in academia that were willing to make their voice heard, we wouldn't be in this dark corner right now. And indeed, we're in a very, very dark corner. In May of 2014, geoengineeringwatch.org first reported its research conclusions, our research conclusions on and we issued our warnings on the ozone depletion and radically increased UV radiation, including substantial levels of even UVC radiation on the surface. You would agree that our warnings in 2014 were indeed justified then, correct?
I don't think that there's any warnings out there that you've put that are not severely justified. What people don't understand is just how critical this upper ozone layer and the entire atmosphere plays in our role in life.
Elaborate. I mean, what's your assessment of the overall ozone destruction situation at this point?
Well, I went back into some of my notes and looked at some of the agencies that I tried to contact as far as giving me some ideas as to what the condition of the ozone layer was, what the radiation levels were, and I involved myself with the series, the Cloud and Earth Radiant Energy System satellite that has the scanning microbolometer on it, which is all very technical, but basically they monitor the radiation that the Earth emits. The sun hits the Earth re-radiates some of the energy, and they monitor this with a satellite to give an Earth energy balance, to know how much is staying in the Earth for climate change purposes. They want to know, is the Earth heating up or is it cooling off, which is a whole other conundrum by itself. But in the process, I learned that their instruments were insufficient to measure UVC radiation. Now, I have a background in metrology that has taught me wavelengths from 200 to 2400 nanometers, and I've performed calibration in those regions. All of the satellite data that I could find stopped at 300 nanometers.
If I could back up and break that down and hold that thought, I want to break it down for those listening so they understand the bandwidths of UV radiation, with UVA at the top, UVB, UVC, and then X-ray. And we're told all UV radiation hitting the planet is either UVA and UVB. We're told that UVC is stopped 100,000 feet up in the atmosphere, which we know is absolutely not true. So elaborating in the bandwidths you're speaking about in the UVC range, and how I'll let you continue on from there. I just wanted to break that down for listeners, that we're in a band of UV radiation that we're not being told about, that's intentionally not being looked for. You can't find what you're not looking for, and that we're all being exposed to, correct?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, most of the information, most of the data that's gathered stops at 300 nanometers, which is only mid-part down through the UV. It's slightly more than midpoint down in the UVB measurements. UVB goes down to 281 nanometers.
Correct.
So there's more energy coming out of the UVB region than what's being talked about, because their instruments won't measure below 300 nanometers. The spectral radiometer that I'm using for data gathering goes from 200 to 450, which covers the UVC, UVB, UVA, and some of the visible light. So I've got the entire UV spectrum already picked out here. Go ahead.
In summary, I'll let you continue. I didn't mean to cut you off, but when you're done elaborating, let us know, based on everything you've seen and all the metering you've done with the equipment that we arranged once we connected with you so you could do this work. Tell us how alarmed you are at what you're seeing, at the readings you're getting. Continue.
Well, when I took readings at Mount Hamilton a year ago, I came back and processed the data. My conclusion was that 80% of the ozone layer was already gone. And I may have some refinements on that, but that's a pretty damn close estimate right now. And this is a year later, and I just completed measurements at Mount Hamilton again. Now, what this means is that of all these agencies out there, and we start with the World Health Organization, the CDC, Stanford University, Science Direct, Vermont University, all of these people, and this is a direct quote from the website at the World Health Organization, they state, quote, short wavelength UVC is the most damaging type of UV radiation, period. However, comma, it is completely filtered by the atmosphere and does not reach the Earth's surface, period.
Which is an absolute
that's a false
lie.
Statement.
Absolute lie.
That's
Yes.
Totally false. Yes, it is. How can I go out and measure something that doesn't exist? Okay. Now, the instrument that I use is manufactured by a very notable company. They have an extreme reputation as building laboratory standards, and that's what this unit is. The calibration is traceable to NIST, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and it's qualified under the ISO 17025, which is the most stringent of all the International Standards Organization rules. Okay, what this is telling me is that this company has manufactured this and will go to court and state the accuracies of their particular instrument. And this is critical.
It is critical, and I know that your readings certainly also, though, are corroborated by what we see on the ground, as our first reports from geoengineeringwatch.org were. We see scorched trees, the Cambrian layer on tree trunks are fried all the way to the core wood. We see this in the forest. We have people in urban areas and so-called experts trying to claim this is a result of windshields and parking lots and so forth. All absolute lies. We see the same thing in the forest. No parking lots, no windshields, native trees, same thing. Leaf scorch, bark scorch. We have peer-reviewed reports on fish being sunburned now, whales' backs being sunburned now. And we have, Ray, you've probably seen in the last week, we now have corroboration of another fact that geoengineeringwatch.org has tried to disclose for nearly a decade, that the insect life is completely collapsing. We had confirmation of that, peer-reviewed confirmation about a week ago, finally, that in their case, they said 75 to 80% of the insects had declined. Our studies in Northern California, working with former service biologists, have shown a 90% decline. Aquatic and terrestrial insects, the UVC radiation, obviously extremely harmful to insect life and microbial life. Yes, Ray?
Exactly, Dane, and that's what prompted me onto the UVC radiation. I have learned there is a extreme. When the World Health Organization said that it's extremely dangerous, they neglected to state why. Okay, I know why. Because 270 nanometers, which is right in the UVC spectrum, is resonant with our DNA and RNA. What this means is that we have, and this is a scientific term, it says our bodies have an actinic, ACTINIC, response to 270 nanometer radiation. What that means is that the sensitivity, the fact that our DNA is responded to this radiation, we are actually 9,000 times more sensitive to this particular wavelength of radiation than any other radiation in the solar spectrum. And what that means is that when we experience 1 microwatt per square centimeter of radiation, you multiply that times 9,000, and then times another 10,000 to get into a square meter calculation. We're having as much energy on us as a 100-watt light bulb over a square meter, which is
energy that's in a very negative form, I think, is what people need to digest as well. And on this, go ahead.
It's resonant, and
yes,
if you've been traveling in your car, the window's down, your arm's sticking out there, and there's direct sunlight on it, the surface of your skin feels hot. Okay, it's hot because your DNA and RNA on the surface of your skin are dying. That's the long and the short of it. That's where the pain comes from, because those cells in the DNA is being resonated apart. That radiation is literally tearing the DNA chains and strands apart because of the increased energy. It's like putting your arm up next to a 100-watt incandescent light bulb.
Now, on the form of that, again, in regard to UVC, it's important people understand this is even used for sterilizing laboratories. UVC radiation is used. So
yes, and that's an excellent point, because when you go outside, since everybody denies that UVC is reaching the Earth's surface, I had no references to monitor to say what is normal, what isn't normal, or what's safe and what isn't safe. But through industry use of these, what they call germicidal lamps, which are used to sterilize surgical instruments and other things they may use in surgery, or to do DNA gene splicing, they use 270 nanometers of extreme low intensities. Theirs is less than 0.1 microwatts per square centimeter. 0.1. And what we're seeing out there on a standard day is 1 microwatt per square centimeter.
10 times.
We're seeing 10 times more than what the industry standard is for a maximum hourly rate.
Now, if the geoengineering programs continue, and I recognize, and we have always acknowledged at geoengineeringwatch.org, there are many forms of anthropogenic damage to the planet. It's important people understand that, because we have many who would like to, there's many people in the population that would like to try to convince themselves that there's no other damage to the biosphere except geoengineering, and that's certainly not true. There's many forms of damage also to the atmosphere. We have the rocket launches, the aircraft traffic, we have the other countless forms of anthropogenic pollution sources. But that being said, we know that the intentional dispersion of particulates into the atmosphere causes, for many reasons, the UV damage. We have also the radio frequency microwave transmissions, and all of this, it's a virtual assault against the atmosphere. I think you'd agree with that from countless directions. If we keep going, if geoengineering is not exposed and stopped, and the current rate of destruction from many sources, but let's look at geoengineering as being at the top of that list, how long on the current trajectory would you estimate until complete ozone layer collapse?
That's a good question, because when I came back a year ago, I said that if this continues as is, by 2025, we'd no longer be able to grow crops on the Earth's surface because of the intense UV radiation. What they have done since is destroy more of the ozone layer, but it's in a really strange way. The formation of the ozone layer is very simple. Wave action on the ocean allows oxygen molecules to be created. Wind currents will take those oxygen way up to the top of atmosphere.
And including boreal forests, the second largest source, and just to elaborate for listeners, plankton being the largest single source of oxygen production on the planet, boreal forests being the second. But from these oxygen sources, continue.
With the oxygen that's created, the idea is nature has it to get that oxygen up to the top of atmosphere. Once it's at top of atmosphere, as soon as this radiation, the UV radiation, hits the oxygen molecule, which is an O2 molecule, there is a resonance formed with the O2 molecule. What that does is split it up. It breaks it apart. So now we have free radicals floating around that combine with other O2 particles. They become O3 particles, which is ozone. Now, what happens when it changes to ozone is that its resonant frequency changes. That harmful radiation no longer penetrates the O3 and doesn't have the same effect. It is absorbed and redirected. It doesn't reach the Earth's surface with a healthy ozone layer. But we don't have that now because of pollution, and I'm talking industrial pollution, all of the bad things that we've done to our atmosphere, all of the fossil fuels, all of the coolant systems, the ammonia coolant systems that they have for the nuclear reactors that leak and they can't fix them because there's no way to fix them, so they just put more coolant material in it, and that leaks out into the atmosphere as well. And now we have the methane releases. The problem is, with the geoengineering, they're putting particulates out in the atmosphere, and these particulates, being nanosized, are like sponges. It just grabs everything around it, and it forms a nucleus. Well, that's fine, except it's grabbing the O2 molecule that should be reaching the top of atmosphere. It can't reach the top of atmosphere anymore. They're destroying the ozone layer by limiting the amount of oxygen that can get there. And right now, I couldn't tell you exactly how much is there because of the geoengineering efforts going on right now.
And when we look in the totality... I'm sorry, go ahead, Ray.
Well, the geoengineering is... They're playing with a double-edged sword. Okay, number one, we have the health issues associated with all these metal particulates they're putting up. And they didn't even study that before they put them up. They just did it.
Correct.
And I have issue with that. Okay, that's
who wouldn't? If I can hold that thought, if I can elaborate on that though, and who wouldn't have issue with that? The fact that you have the entire climate science community discussing the need to deploy tens of millions of tons of these particulates into the atmosphere as if it hasn't been going on for 70 years already, and not one of those institutions ever mentions, oh, by the way, all of this will settle down to Earth where we all get to absorb it, highly toxic particles. And this is the sort of Orwellian nightmare that we live in, and the total betrayal. Ray, would you say that's the correct word, that academia taken as a whole, and I understand that many are under threat, but that doesn't excuse their willful cooperation with the power structure, that academia as a whole has, in so many ways and in so many particular subject arenas of academia, have betrayed the human race and the web of life by lying about all the issues we've already discussed and those we are going to discuss. Betrayal is the right word, is it not?
You know, it's hard to point a finger. I've talked to these guys who still believe a certain way. And it really doesn't matter what you call them. They're still idiots, okay? They're idiots because they're not thinking of the consequences of their actions. They don't think beyond this. Most of these projects were started by research grant monies in the universities and at NASA. People just went along with the money. They were employed to do a certain job, and they did that certain job. They didn't get an overall picture. You know, they took their paycheck home, they bought their beer, and they watched the football games. That's what they did. And these scientists could be your next-door neighbor. I'm very disappointed in the science community because they haven't thought down the road. They haven't said, well, what are the effects going to be on the environment before we do this? They just did it. And
now we're in a place from which we cannot return. We can't return to the planet we've formerly known. Perhaps we can salvage some part of it, but my jadedness of using the term betrayal, and I've been in the field with USDA soil scientists whom I know fairly well, have worked with extensively, and taking, for example, soil pH testing. We have the baselines, USDA baselines, and them seeing, while working with me, radical departures from the baselines, as much as, in several cases, 20 times escalation in the baseline numbers. Astounding, from what should have been 5.2 to 7.2, from a highly acidic soil to an alkaline soil. And that's from the fallout from climate engineering. And these scientists would not and will not acknowledge this publicly. They won't, because they want their paycheck and their pension. And that's the kind of betrayal I'm talking about. And now we're talking about the cost of being total absolutely the consequences being total. And as you stated so appropriately, so many in academia never, ever bother to consider the consequences of their actions. And is that not a form of criminal negligence, would you say?
It's idiocy. I mean, it's planned obsolescence is what it is for the rest of humanity.
For the rest of life, the web of life on Earth. In regard to, oh, sorry, go ahead.
You mentioned about the insects, that you finally had validation on your claims with the insects.
Correct.
Well, it coming from the UVC and the 270 nanometer point of view, it's very easy to understand. Most insects don't have that much of a barrier to the UV radiation, the UVC radiation. They're going to go first.
Yes.
You know, I mean, all of the insects are man, I have seen maybe 10% in my backyard compared to 3 years ago.
And when they go, we will follow. Yes. That's the bottom of the food chain. We'll follow. And if in regard to the crop production right now in Northern California, in our raised garden that we once had a jungle in with very little effort, we can't grow anything there now. Nothing grows, let alone fruits, let alone ripens. And some people in some places with ideal conditions and maybe particular soils that might have chelated some of the fallout from climate engineering that did not made it less effective or impactful. Some people are producing obviously some things, but it's important the U.S. population understands that we also have imported food from all over the world, $20 billion plus worth annually. Why? To keep our shelves stocked while other countries starve, to keep the American population pacified until the last possible moment. So in regard to the collapse, the complete collapse of the ozone layer, I understand it's not possible to predict the exact time frame. There are many variables, but we face a very dire and immediate situation. I think you would agree with that. If and when total ozone layer collapses, and we are certainly headed there at breakneck speed, your estimation, what happens to us and the web of life on Earth with total ozone layer collapse?
It's real simple. If you can't grow food, there's nothing to eat. Everything goes.
Game over.
Game over.
Game over for terrestrial and most aquatic life as well. Correct, Ray? We lose the plankton. The plankton are fried in the upper levels of the ocean from the UV right now. We're 60% down on global plankton populations right now, 60% or more. So we're looking at if we have total ozone layer collapse, we're looking at a perhaps total aquatic life collapse as well. Correct?
Dane, I know you're a diver, and I think you've spent time in the Great Barrier Reef.
I have.
95% of that is gone forever.
And do you hear anyone mentioning the UV about that? No one. They only mention the warmer water, which is true. That's true. I've been on 2 barrier reef expeditions, and the warmer water, obviously a huge factor, but no one mentions the UV. It's the taboo subject that no one is allowed to talk about. Ray, from our discussions, and I know you're hitting locked doors, so to speak, in regard to your attempts to get any useful data from official agencies. Any more breakthroughs on that front, or are you still getting basically stonewalled?
I'm still getting stonewalled. I mean, some of these people are just in it to grab the paycheck and retire and hope to move away from it. I'm hoping right now that, the present administration has basically denied that there's any climate change going on Earth, but yet they're still talking about geoengineering projects. Well, why would you have a geoengineering project in the first place if there's no climate change? It looks like they want to control the weather no matter what. And as they do so, they will destroy completely the upper ozone layer. Then we're going to have a challenge.
And at the same time, facing populations that can't feed themselves, collapsing oceans, collapsing crops, collapsing harvests, We just saw as of today, as of the date of us recording this particular exchange, that we see now the EPA is going to ban any independent scientists from any of the panels. The only ones that get to sit on the deciding boards will be those who are being paid by the government. Now, how?
Sure, with a non-disclosure agreement behind them, so that they can't open their mouth.
And also representing the industries that the EPA is supposed to protect the public from their irresponsible behavior. This is a complete gutting of any environmental protection, as you so correctly stated. The current administration, and all administrations are bad, so people listening to this interview understand, to criticize the current administration is not to praise former administrations. All are bad. Governments of other countries, all bad. But this is the biggest, most powerful country, military 10 times, or as big as the next 10 militaries combined. This is where the biggest corruption, the biggest destruction is coming from our country. And the current administration, representing the military-industrial complex, virtually gutting environmental protection, claiming there's nothing wrong with the environment or the climate, at the same time ramping up climate engineering programs. So we have clearly an attempt to keep business as usual as long as possible, even at the cost of killing the entire planet. Now, on official agencies, Ray, have been falsifying UV data, because when they don't disclose or not measuring for, they're falsifying that data or hiding the truth altogether. As we've discussed in our interaction, it appears that this really began to radically take place about 1980. Is that correct? In that realm?
That would be a good guess. And the hard part is there has been no UVC data gathered of any significance that I can compare my data to find out what is normal.
At any point.
There should be some, at any point.
We're just simply told that
with a healthy ozone layer. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. We're just on the UVC. We're just simply told, don't worry, none of it hits the Earth, which is patently false.
Right, and it obviously they're wrong. The sad part is, I had one scientist who worked at George Washington University, who recently did a solar panel project, and he increased the efficiency of the solar panel up to 45%. And he listed 250 nanometers as the bottom range of the solar panel. And I got very interested in that because I was hoping to corroborate data with him. Well, they used what they call a solar source, and it was actually a programmable lamp that they used to simulate solar energy at those frequencies. So I still have yet, and I've searched for 4 years, Dane, I have yet to find someone who has taken a lab-quality instrument and measured Earth's surface UV radiation. It just doesn't exist.
But isn't that astounding and a very dismal testimony to the willful failures of humanity and even of academia, that we could live in a world where such basic threats are not even addressed? In my background in solar energy, formerly with Bechtel Power 3 decades ago, but at my home being completely off-grid, losing massive amounts of my solar power uptake from whatever these aircraft were emitting from. For those that don't know how I got into this battle, that's how I got into it. My home was on the cover of the world's largest renewable energy magazine. It was a big solar system, was producing about half the power it should have produced because the sky was obscured with whatever these aircraft were emitting. And I knew something was radically wrong. Began to research, found mountains of data on the climate engineering issue, was shocked that I had not seen, heard, or wasn't aware of it. Began to test my rain, found massive amounts of aluminum, barium, strontium, all elements from climate engineering patents. Those elements escalated. In an 18-month period, I had test escalate 50,000%. From 7 ppb, parts per billion of aluminum, to 3,450. We're talking about an unimaginable amount of toxic materials. And I want anybody listening to this exchange to understand how much material it takes to blot out the sun, enough for me to lose 70, 80% of my solar power uptake. 70 to 80%. every bit of that material settles down to Earth. And we have the entire climate science community discussing geoengineering, and none of them acknowledging it's been going on for 70 years, and none of them acknowledge that this practice obviously puts unimaginable amounts of toxic particles into the air that we all get to breathe and absorb. Again, so this is the failure of humanity to be able to face and acknowledge the truth, or to tell the truth, especially in so many circles of academia, agencies, elected officials. As you said, Ray, people that are our neighbors, sometimes family members. It's truly astounding that we can be in this dark, dark place. And not only are we not hitting the brakes, we're hitting the accelerator. Are we not? As you just described correctly with the current administration and what we see happening, not just with that administration, but in other countries as well. Everybody trying to improve, expand their GDP, their growth rates on a finite planet with finite resources that's dying by the day. The only thing people are worried about is increasing their retirement account and expanding gross domestic product. Does that, Ray, strike you as being a very suicidal tendency in our species?
Yeah, it's like lemmings jumping off into the ocean, Dane. They're just grabbing at resources, and eventually they'll have wars break out over that. You know, they're pushing for that all the time.
As already we have happening.
What's really phenomenal is that because of the geoengineering efforts going on, and then putting all these particulates in the upper atmosphere, they've changed the mix over the years. They had a microparticle that they started out with about 10 years ago. Well, as of about January of this year, they changed that, and they're all nanoparticle size now. So the effects are different. If you go out on a day where you don't see any particular clouds, put your fist over where the sun is and look at the area around the sun. You'll see nothing but white, and that extends out for 35, 40 degrees on either side of your fist. That white is not natural, and people aren't realizing it. Those are the particulates. Those are the nanoparticles that are up there right now. And the smaller they make these particles, we may only have 10% of the ozone layer right now. I don't know. These geoengineering efforts do prevent some of the UVC radiation reaching the Earth's surface. So I couldn't tell you what's real and what isn't real.
But isn't this the paradox, though? The very practice they are engaged in, scattering these particles in the atmosphere, that destroyed or are facilitating the destruction of the ozone layer to begin with. Now that's the premise on which they're ramping up the programs even more to try to perhaps block some of the UVC that their programs destroyed in the first place. So this is the definition of insanity, total insanity.
Exactly.
And we see these silvery white skies when there's for example, especially in the West Coast where we have the ridiculously resilient ridge of high pressure over us that cooks us all summer long in order for the clockwise spin around that high pressure to push the jet stream in the manner that the climate engineers want it to be pushed to deliver moisture where they want it. But the frying effect, the firestorms that are certainly must be connected to the climate engineering operations from every direction. Back to the methane you mentioned, also destroying ozone, connected to climate engineering, disrupting the upper level wind currents, as I just described. That is disrupting ocean currents. We have warm water now pumping into places it shouldn't be, like the Arctic, thawing methane on the seafloor. Methane goes through the water column, enters the atmosphere, is now covering the planet like a layer of glass, destroying more ozone, trapping more heat. Virtually every aspect of climate engineering is wreaking havoc on the planet. But so many are so invested in these programs. Ray, when you try to deliver when you try to share this with your colleagues and share what you know and try to wake them up, how much success have you had in that regard?
Well, zero. They've tried to deny my data and try to tell me that, no, the data has this issue with it. And I call the manufacturer and I explain to them, and The manufacturer, by the way, is International Light Technologies, very renowned company, and they have an excellent engineering staff. And like I said, this unit is traceable to NIST. The data it gathers, when you follow a simple procedure, you start the program, you set up the calibration file, you do a dark reference, you take a reference scan, and then I monitor and record data for 4 to 5 hours every Saturday and Sunday. When you follow those steps, and they're fairly simple, your data is guaranteed to be within the parameters the manufacturer talks about. I can't accept a scientist who has his mind made up before we even discuss the data, because that's what it is. We're fighting an opposition where it doesn't matter what I say. Their mind is made up. They are in a society or a group of people, much like the NOAA with the non-disclosure agreements, where it is internally agreed upon they're not going to discuss the issue with anyone outside the agency, period.
And that's the bottom line.
That's it.
With that in mind, and we see that across the board with academicians who don't know why the insects are dying, they don't know why the fish are dying, they don't know why the trees are dying. Professionals, so-called experts that are paid not to know, paid to hide from any of the real causal factors, mask it from the public, shield it from the public, and that's what we have across the board. And that's the direction we're headed, toward total planetary omnicide, while we have the so-called experts doing everything they can to hide reality from the population until the brutal, bitter end. Ray, if you could deliver a message to those in power, to those that are controlling the climate engineering planetary assault, what would that message be?
Number one, Dane, is they better stop all geoengineering. Otherwise, we don't have much time left, period. Now, in the process of stopping geoengineering, there are things that can be done. We can put oxygen back to the top of atmosphere. That is a possibility. But they're going to have to stop the use of fossil fuels. They're going to have to stop their geoengineering efforts. They're going to have to change the way they live. Otherwise, we're not going to be here.
On that point that you just made, and I fully agree with you on every point you just made, and that's something that so many in society, so many people that you and I know, so many people that will probably listen or perhaps might listen to this exchange don't want to accept, that the fossil fuel fiesta, which is part of the military-industrial complex, is what fuels the climate engineering aircraft, is what causes resource wars all over the globe right now. All of this, any form of human activity that alters the energy balance, which you described earlier in this exchange, Ray, any form of human activity that alters the energy balance of the planet is a problem. And we have countless forms of anthropogenic activity that are doing that. So it ultimately, yes, we have to expose and stop climate engineering. That's first and foremost, and that will continue to be my focus. But you, as you so correctly stated, and I fully agree, that we as a species must accept that the paradigm of industrialized, militarized, fossil-fueled civilization that we have lived under was never, ever sustainable, was it? Never.
No, never. It never was, and it never will be. It's a pollutant. What is happening right now is slowly, very slowly, people are becoming conscious of our environment. But they're being attacked by mass media, who's basically saying everything's great and wonderful, don't worry about it, or denying it. Especially here, I was talking about Governor Brown here in California, proclaiming that all the problems with our forest are the bark beetle. And that just infuriates me, because they're giving you partial truth, okay? The bark beetle does attack a tree who is sick and dying, because that's part of nature.
It's a symptom, though.
Yes.
It's not the...
Yes. And if you want to find out which trees are being destroyed from a bark beetle that's now an infestation. Go look at the tree on how it died. You'll see that the sun side, the south side of the tree, has the brown needles on it. Okay? Radiation, a tree dying by radiation exposure will die very quickly. A tree, when I was a child, it would take 10 years for a tree to die when it was sick for other reasons. If it's sick because of radiation, it's going to die within 2 to 3 years. It's going to be completely gray in 5 years, totally dead, nothing there. When it's dying, the bark beetle does go in and cut the tree down. That's how nature intended it, not the other way around.
A symptom,
yes,
not the
it's a
causal
symptom.
factor. And on this, so if we look at, we know that there are countless aspects of climate engineering that pose immense threats to us, from the contamination of the air column, the poisoning of our soils, disrupting of the hydrological cycle, and so forth. But back to the ozone layer alone. Even if we had no other challenges to face, just the ozone depletion and the ozone collapse, that by itself is an immediate existential threat, is it not?
Yeah.
Immediate existential
and all of these agencies, every agency out there will agree that UVC radiation is the most dangerous form of radiation we can get from the sun.
And it's hitting us now.
It's hitting us now, and it is because of the actinic effect, and we're 9,000 times more sensitive to it at 270 nanometers. We're more sensitive to UVC radiation than we are cosmic radiation and X-rays.
And none of this is being disclosed by the, quote, official agencies. Ray, do you intend to continue to try and sound the alarm on the climate engineering issue no matter what?
You know, Dane, this is more than a passion. Okay, people do things as a passion because they have an interest and it brings them satisfaction. This is a demand. This is something I have to do.
I already knew the answer to that because I know you, but I wanted the listeners to hear that the fight for the greater good is the bottom line for you. And I appreciate that in you, and I know that to be the case. And you can count on me standing with you no matter what. And I would ask everybody listening to understand that just listening to an exchange like this won't help us move the baton up the field. We need people to actually educate themselves, use this tool, share this tool, arm yourself with credible data from a credible source. We try to provide that at geoengineeringwatch.org. Help us get on the playing field, get off the bench, and help us move the ball forward, or we will have no chance. We must reach a critical mass of awareness in the population. We're already communicating with numerous people in government, from former Armed Services Committee people to state reps to other federal people, university people, military people, but we need critical mass of awareness. So we need everyone to help us to credibly sound the alarm. So we must make every day count because time is not on our side. Ray, again, my deepest gratitude to you for the work you've done, for the work you continue to do, which we'll continue to cover, and we'll try to sound the alarm with updates as your research goes on, as we have more frontline data to put with that, as the walls continue to collapse on every front with aquatic ecosystem collapse, biosphere collapse. We'll try to continue to put those frontline reports out so that people understand that if we don't focus on saving the planet's life support systems, nothing else matters. We agree on that final point, right, Ray?
Absolutely. And Dane, I wanted to add on one more thing to listeners that may have access to lab quality spectral radiometers or anything that they can use to measure this UV, A, B, and C radiation. I would love to corroborate data. I mean, when you can come up with two people that have the same information, the effects are immense. You know, white papers happen in the science community. You get peer review. Publication. That's what has to happen in the science community before these people will even budge.
If anybody has that ability to add this to the equation, we can be contacted under the contact section at geoengineeringwatch.org. We will pass that data on. Until our next update on this issue, I want to again encourage everyone to help us to sound the alarm. This is Dane Wigington with geoengineeringwatch.org.